what do we know about Elijah? So there was some ravens who fed him, and there was the Baal prophecy things, there was hiding in the cliff, and there was the whisper and the earthquake and the fire and all that kind of stuff. But he was also a bit of a wimp. In our lives, we need constant reminders of God's faithfulness. We, as a people, as human beings, we are well faulty, and we are really, really, really bad at remembering stuff. We do. We set reminders on our phones and all that kind of stuff. We just don't get it. In Psalm 37 verse 7, it talks about being still and knowing that God is God. And this is where I think it's interesting, because there's a kind of a thing about waiting, you know. And in some respects, we need to be waiters. Now, there's a bit of a play on words there. Yes, we are to wait. Also, we are to be like waiters before God, like in a restaurant. Unlike a undecided diner, however, when we go to God, and an undecided diner might say, I don't know what I want, can you come back later? God might actually say to us, I need for you to wait to hear from me again. Patience is key in our relationship with God. So that might sound a little bit like we have to be the patient one while God has a tantrum. That's not the case. God is the senior partner. God is the more important. And his timing is perfect. Sometimes we don't agree, sometimes we don't see it that way, but it is, and we have to trust in him. God, however, lives outside of time. So, to God, now, then, and will be are exactly the same. They all work at the same time. So, I don't know what that must feel like, to be able to say to someone the answer, that the answer's already been said, and to wait for the answer at exactly the same moment. God's perspective of things is so much different than ours. In that respect too, his words must impact us more. If he can see everything and has already experienced it and is going to experience it and experiencing it now, his words should have so much more impact. But we're faulty, and really we're kind of faithless. We forget. In Ephesians, we know that God has prepared for In Ephesians 2, we find out that Mark's giggling again. In Ephesians 2, we find out that God has prepared stuff for us to do beforehand. It means that he's thought about stuff for us to do, and it's mad. We like to comfort ourselves with nice things from the Bible. For example, Jeremiah 29 verse 11. It's very nice, isn't it? Very nice, Jeremiah 29. Yeah, it's very, very nice, very nice. And it says to us stuff like, you know, he's got a plan and a purpose for us, which is all very great. But we're not Jewish. Well, some of us might be if you're watching it on YouTube, but our youth group aren't. It was specifically for the Jews while they were in exile. None of us are Jewish and in exile. That whole section, that from verse 1, sets the context to say that God wants us to be fruitful where we are. And maybe that's more for us. Where God has placed us, he wants us to be fruitful, to put down roots, to say, Lord, use me where I am. And then God says, because I have a plan and a purpose for you, but be where you are. The biggest thing that God says in that chapter is that he is with them in it. And that's a really big thing that we need reminding of, that God is constantly with us, always in it with us. Do you know, this is kind of why I think Jesus instituted communion. Not as a ritual, but for us to keep coming back to that idea of what Jesus has done for us. We need a moment to stop and think and be reminded, because without it I think that we would just take it for granted, that we would just leave it to one side, that actually we need to keep coming back to what Matt Redman would call the heart of worship, about Jesus, about everything to do with him. We need to do things to remind ourselves of his goodness. But looking back at Elijah, the reason why Elijah was a little bit of a wimp was because while he was praying in the cave with all the fire and the earthquake and all that kind of stuff, he said that he was the only one left. The only one left, and that... But God corrected him and said, I am God, and I've got a remnant saved for myself. There are 7,000 prophets who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Bearing in mind that just before all of this stuff, that Elijah had called on fire from heaven to burn up a sacrifice, to show up Baal in front of 400 of his prophets. Or prophets. So it's not like he had a crisis of faith. It's because he was a human being. He needed reminding of how good God was, and he did freaking miracles every other day. So, if Elijah needed reminding of that, and Jesus had to say, do this until I come, in remembrance of me, maybe we need to do things to remind ourselves just how good God really is. This is why we need church. This is why we need the Bible. This is why we need each other and to be in prayer. Because we need to constantly remind ourselves how good God really is. So in some respects, don't be like Elijah. Be like Jesus.